Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Lopez. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who of course is co-host of this meeting, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, Chair of the African Union Commission, who will be making her opening statement. Thank you very much indeed, Madam Zuma.
And welcome to the African capital, Addis Ababa. I'd like to just greet the outgoing chair of the Bureau of the Ministers of Finance and Economic Planning and Monetary Affairs, and then greet the head of government of the capital of Africa, the Prime Minister of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, Mr. Haile Mariam Desalegn, and of course, the Vice President of Namibia and the Prime Minister of the DRC, and my brother, Carlos, and Excellencies, Ministers of Finance, Economic Planning, Monetary Affairs, and Integration, and let me not forget to greet the Africa Forum of former heads of state and government, chaired by the former president of Mozambique, President Jacob Chissano, the commissioners of the AU, honorable central bank governors, excellencies, representatives of UN agencies, diplomatic corps, international agencies, officials from our capitals, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen. Again, a very warm welcome to Addis Ababa for this critical gathering of the joint AU-UNECA meeting of finance, monetary affairs, economic planning, and integration ministers. And we always appreciate the hospitality that is become legendary from the Ethiopian host. Excellencies, this critical meeting this year takes place in the context where we have concluded the adoption of Agenda 2063 and its first 10-year plan implementation, and the Sustainable Development Goals. And indeed, we have started domestication and implementation. Now, the Agenda 2063 and Sustainable Development Goals, in our assessment, has 90% convergence. And so we have to work how we're going to ensure that we work together, the monitoring, the evaluation mechanisms, because this is two agendas that are not mutually exclusive. And of course, Agenda 2063 is Africa-specific, and we must keep that in mind. This focus of this important forum, therefore, needs to remain unflinchingly on the task of economic transformation, how to foster rapid economic growth based on sustainable industrialization, diversification that creates jobs and enhances access to basic services for our citizens, reduces inequality, and eradicates poverty. And indeed, all these things are very urgent because our youth are becoming very impatient. Because if you have young people who are idle, who are not at work, it's a potential problem. At the same time, there are critical trends which we can either allow to derail the implementation of Agenda 2063 or strategize and act together so that we defend the gains of the last decade and accelerate economic transformation. Let me highlight a few of those, but most of them have been highlighted also by my brother Carlos. But let me start with that there is a general agreement on the skills crisis that we face on the continent. Shortage of skilled personnel is amongst the concerns raised consistently by business leaders as undermining competitiveness and confidence. Africa's contribution to innovation, science and technology, and patents lag behind. And in the study by the African Capacity Building Foundation on capacities needed for Agenda 2063, the skills deficit in key areas such as engineering, science, including agricultural scientists, run into the millions. The same study shows that, with the notable exception of Ethiopia, over 90% of our graduates are in social sciences. And so our youth bulge, with our youth bulge, we must therefore ensure that more of them are educated and skilled, especially in the science, technology, and engineering and math sectors, so that they can be the drivers of innovation and development. Secondly, Your Excellencies, over the last few years, we have been talking about the critical issue of industrialization and economic diversification. At country and regional levels, we are beginning to see initiatives for beneficiation of key African commodities, from cassava to leather, textiles, light manufacturing, and pharmaceuticals, as well as beneficiation in the extractive sector, oil and gas, and minerals, including diamonds, albeit at infant level. Our ministers of finance and economic planning, as well as central bankers, must help us to foster conditions to support industrial policy, including macroeconomic policy and job creation. For us to turn our youth bulge into an opportunity, we must create millions of jobs each year, in addition to skilling our young people and women. Excellencies, the Paris climate negotiations resulted in important global commitments to reduce emissions and move towards greener growth. As a continent, we have an opportunity, as has been said, to shape our economic growth and industrialization in a much greener climate, and using climate-smart agriculture, renewable energy, and reforestation, and other green technologies. Our guest speaker yesterday at the Addis lecture, Professor Haotung Cheng, highlighted the impact of manufacturing on economic development and the need to start and learn by doing, and not wait until you think you have an excellent model. We recognize that countries have and are taking initiatives, but more needs to be done to accelerate, aggregate, and strengthen this, so that the accelerated industrial development of Africa gains momentum. Furthermore, we cannot look at others to fund our industrialization, because they are unlikely to do so. We must therefore get on with the program set out in the strategy for IDA implementation, in facilitating access to credit, private financial resources, regional stock markets, investments by development financial institutions, and harnessing resources in pension and other funds for industrialization. Again, we need to hear your views as ministers and central bankers on this issue. Thirdly, the challenges we face in agriculture with extreme weather conditions mean that we must do more to ensure the modernization of agriculture and agro-processing. Because we know this year some regions have been facing extreme droughts, but we've also been told that that's going to change this year. Those that have been facing droughts are likely to face floods. So it means that the problem will continue. So we must look at actually raising investments in agriculture, and CADEP had asked for 10% of the budget, which is meant to help build resilience in agriculture, increase agricultural land under irrigation, building storage facilities, provide access to seeds and extension services, and improving logistics. It is not something that we should be proud of, that 83% of the food, especially the processed food we consume, is imported, and therefore take a lot of our revenue in foreign currency by buying those 83% of that food. So it is important that ministers of economic planning, finance, and integration look at how we reverse this trend. In product line by product line, and working together to build regional value chains. As we deal with the effects of extreme weather conditions, we must respond also to the immediate humanitarian situation faced by farmers and rural communities. But at the same time, not delay what should be done today to build resilience and climate-smart agriculture. This includes the implementation of CADEP and raising investments in agriculture. Fourthly, over the last decade or so, public sector investment in much needed infrastructure, transport, social infrastructure, ICT, energy, etc., has grown at a faster pace than general government expenditure. And we must be proud that the majority of our infrastructure is funded by our own governments. So we must defend and expand this trend, since this too has been part of the drivers for growth that we have seen over the last decade or so. In fact, we have to be bold and make the choices on these investments, since infrastructure is so critical to economic diversification and industrialization, especially energy. Some countries are now constrained by energy in terms of increasing their industrialization. And I'm glad that Carlos has started to address the concern raised in the roundtable I was at yesterday about African countries that are being told not to borrow beyond a certain percentage of their GDP, even when they need these investments for infrastructure, and which is so critical for economic and social development. So I hope that the ministers and central bankers will discuss this further, because one of the ministers raised this as a real concern. Fifthly, it has been said that before that we must develop the African private sector to build its competitiveness, innovation, and transformative impact. Across the continent in many sectors, finance, construction, cement, telecommunication, retail, agro-processing, in shipping, we have companies, large and small, medium, that are entrepreneurial and are agile and are striving to meet the needs of African consumers. Many of them are playing an important role in economic integration and intra-African trade and investment. As governments, regional economic communities, and continental institutions, we must do much more to support the growth of this African private sector, including facilitating entrance into new sectors such as the green and blue economies, as a critical part of our industrial policy. It also means that as continental leadership, we must continue to engage global institutions on Africa's right and indeed responsibility to pursue our own indigenous development framework, since those imposed on us during the 80s and 90s have so dismally failed the African people. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, critical to all the above is what we do at a country and regional level to ensure that we develop our people, build infrastructure, grow our economies, and develop people-centered institutions that put the interest of the African people first. In addition, as part of this drive, we must continue to push for integration. The reality is that the cost of non-integration is growing in the aviation, other transport sectors, in the energy sectors, and in building viable regional value chains, and in our skills deficit. As a continent, we are making progress. If we look at the advances by RECs such as EAC and ECOWAS on free movement of people and goods, all the RECs on their transport corridors, and in some of the regional customs unions, and intra-African trade and investment, intra-regional trade in intermediate and capital goods grew at about 11% annually between 1990 and 2013. The first negotiation meeting of the CFTA, the Continental Free Trade Agreement, set in Addis Ababa last month to develop its work program after the launch in 2015. The regional energy pools across the continent are increasingly playing a critical role to plan for them and to mobilize for investment in energy generation, transmission, including renewable energy. In the January summit of the AU, they adopted a decision that called on countries to introduce a 30-day visa on arrival for all citizens from African countries, so as to encourage intra-African trade, investments, and tourism. And member states are required to report on this by the time of the summit in July this year. It is worth repeating that the continent will not develop if it tries to do so with half of its resources. How public resources is spent between the genders, the economic empowerment of girls and women, and their involvement in the development of critical sectors such as agriculture, agro-processing, in manufacturing, in the extractive and trade, the maritime and green economy, not only as micro and subsistence level, but across the value chain, remains critical for ministers of finance, economic planning, integration to consider and keep in mind. As I said last year at one of the roundtables of this meeting, that there is nothing micro about women. So we need to move from micro to normal. We must thank our statisticians general for their work they have and are doing on Agenda 2063 and SDG monitoring and evaluation framework and indicators. In addition to strengthening and working towards an Africa data revolution, this will help to ensure that we monitor progress and build collective accountability for the implementation of Agenda 2063. We must all do more to resolutely push towards all these issues critical to growth and integration. Excellencies, as ministers of this forum, you are and have been seized with the matter of financing of development at country level and more general at regional and continental level. We agree that domestic resource mobilization is critical to sustain the speed on African development and financing of Agenda 2063, including improvements in revenue collection and expenditure, stemming illicit flows from the continent and ensuring domestic resource that domestic resources are invested in the continent rather than elsewhere. This remains a critical challenge. A number of studies launched over the weekend address this issue, but we need to implement. The example of the African Risk Capacity Agency and its interventions as a fairly young institution in capacity and funding to build resilience in managing drought is important. And we again call on all our countries to join in this collective African effort. Therefore, the continental monetary and finance institutions such as the African Central Bank and Monetary Fund are also critical towards development of a financial architecture that aids integration and harmonization of financial rules and regulations, as well as facilitate intra-African trade and investments. Excellencies, the bi-ministerial retreat of the executive in January 2014 called on the establishment of an African economic platform that will enable a strategic dialogue amongst governments, the private sector and academia on the role each sector in moving forward these critical priorities issues mentioned above. We will be organizing the first of these platforms at the beginning of June, back to back with the assembled retreat with heads of state and government and ministers of finance on the issue of financing of Agenda 2063 and the AU. Lastly, but not least, we have just concluded the 7th UN Regional Coordinating Mechanism for Africa, where we agreed on joint implementation between the AU, REX, and the UN system and agencies on Agenda 2063 and Sustainable Development Goals, including common indicators and monitoring and evaluation framework. So we'll be getting all those recommendations from this meeting. This is an important step forward to ensure that we all pursue the same goals, that we allocate resources effectively, and that we gather, monitor progress together. The deliberations over these couple of days should therefore provide important pointers to what needs to be done to move the implementation of these critical issues to the next level. I wish you a successful deliberations and look forward to the outcomes of the meeting. I thank you.